It's practically impossible that the Nazis, fighting on two fronts, could have won World War II. But for the sake of a thought experiment, regardless of how unlikely such a course of events may have been, let's just say that they'd somehow managed to magically conquer and keep all of Eastern Europe. And then Hitler's abominable plans were implemented all across this massive Nazi state. Now, let's fast forward way past this genocidal foundation to say 200 years in the future, and imagine that somehow this state still exists, with its borders largely unchanged since the initial Eastern conquest. With all of the changes that such a time frame would inevitably entail, what might it look like? Well, we could use an actually presently existing country to give us an approximate idea. So, which one has foundations that are most similar to our Nazi hypothetical here? Not necessarily exactly the same, but most similar. Believe it or not, the answer to that question is easily the United States of America. And this is no coincidence, because there is a clear ideological and practical continuity between the early USA and Nazi plans to colonize Eastern Europe. This led top Nazis to repeatedly declare their intent to replicate the USA's westward expansion. Adolf Hitler, for example, said that, "In the East, a similar process will repeat itself for a second time as in the conquest of America, that the natives of Eastern Europe should be looked upon as Indians," and noted approvingly that the Americans had shot down the millions of Indians to a few 100,000, which he hoped to replicate in Eastern Europe. The most well-known aspects of Nazism are its dictatorial, cult-like nationalism and fanatical, genocidal anti-Semitism. But less commonly known, and also intrinsically linked to those other aspects, is the primary motivation behind the Nazi invasion of Eastern Europe that started World War II. Their desire to conquer huge amounts of territory for German colonization and settlement. Nazi Germany's planned and partly carried out expansion into Eastern Europe was, like the westward expansion of the USA, a project of settler colonialism, conquest and territorial expansion undertaken not simply for the purposes of ruling over and extracting wealth from the population and resources of these territories, but rather with the intent to clear all or most of this land of its prior inhabitants so that it can be directly and permanently settled by people considered to be a part of the conquering group. This requires them to somehow deal with those who were already living there, through means which have in practice ranged from forced assimilation, to forced deportations, to outright mass killings, or even multiple or all of those at the same time. The result is a specific system of relations where the conquering population dominates the original ones, or whatever remains of them, and shapes the land, its future, and its dominant society as they see fit. And any continued existence of indigenous populations is seen as a problem that will eventually require a solution. The USA was not the Nazis' only inspiration in their plans to colonize Eastern Europe. They were also obviously influenced by German history and borrowed from other examples such as the British Empire. But the evidence presented here will show that, overall, American influence was more significant than that of any other precedent, particularly because the USA was also the primary practical and ideological reference point used by the earlier German colonialist in Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, who committed the Herero and Nama genocide in the early 1900s. Their ideology and practices were then influential on the Nazis, who modified them for their own purposes and picked up the American influence in the process. Then there were also more further direct influences, which were so pervasive that, aside from the aforementioned direct references to the US that I cited, they can be seen directly in Nazi plans and practices. They even tried to implement their own US-style native reservations, for example. When all said and done, a direct line between American and Nazi colonialism can be clearly traced. And I'm going to explain just how. By the end of this video, we'll see that Nazism was not just some alien phenomenon that came out of nowhere, but rather a radicalization of earlier European settler colonialism, and in particular, the strain developed in the USA. Except this time, implemented on the European mainland itself. British colonization of North America dated back to the end of the 16th century. Within a little over 100 years, the British Empire had conquered, stolen, treated for, or bought almost all of the land on the East Coast and implanted their own settlers there. In many cases during this process, Indians were forced off their land through displacement or killing, but also in many others, the two groups managed to form a sort of uneasy coexistence with one another, avoiding large-scale violent conflict and instead engaging in mutually beneficial trade and cultural exchange. The British central government's main goal in its colonies was to maximize the extraction of wealth and other benefits for the mother country. Similar was also generally true in other large parts of North America, ruled by France and Spain, with whom the British often competed for dominion over Indian lands and alliances with Indian nations. But the British differed from the French and Spanish in one key way. These rivals populated their North American colonies with the bare minimum amount of Europeans needed to maintain and exploit them. The French were mostly interested in securing privileged access to trade goods, while the Spanish wanted to lord over native populations, using them as a forced or cheap labor force to exploit local resources. However, the British Crown promoted larger-scale European migration and settlement, intending to extract benefits for the homeland by trading with, taxing, etc., their own settlers, who would exploit the land directly themselves, or through slaves. And due to their strength in numbers, they could also conquer, secure, and exploit much more land than their rivals, and were more capable of enforcing their territorial claims against these other European powers. Thus, European settlers flooded into British North America. By 1750, settlers in French North America numbered only about 75,000, while those in the British parts numbered around 1.5 million, despite the fact that the two powers claimed similarly large tracts of land. After the French and Indian War, which began in 1754 and ended in 1763, things changed drastically. The British won the war, and France relinquished many of their claims to the land west of Britain's East Coast colonies, though this was complicated by the fact that these claims were mostly theoretical. In actual practice, Native Americans still lived in and controlled practically all of this land, and had never remotely agreed to cede it, especially not all of it so completely. King George III, the monarch of the British Empire, was well aware of this. He knew that regardless of whatever pieces of paper he had that said that these lands were British, actually moving into them would immediately cause widespread conflict with the multiple Indian nations who lived there. So, tired of costly wars to defend white settlers, who had a habit of trying to steal Indian land, which inevitably provoked retaliation, and then seeking help from the British government with the conflict that they'd started, the king decided to temporarily forbid them from expanding west of the Appalachian Mountains. But the British settler population saw this limitation as an intolerable slight. In the late 17th and early 18th century, European settlers had begun to identify themselves along racial lines. While there were still also divisions along national and religious lines, Western and Northern Europeans were, nonetheless, now considered to be part of a unified white race. This categorization was invented out of the need for a new legal and moral justification for African slavery. Previously, within the British Empire, slavery had been justified on the basis of religion. Africans were not Christians and therefore were heathens, and thus it was considered both legal and moral for Christians to enslave them. But African slaves started converting to Christianity and pleading for their freedom on that basis, which posed an obvious problem for the slave owners. So they developed a new method of categorization based on immutable physical characteristics, which would ensure that they could be kept enslaved whether they were Christian or not. Thus, Europeans became white to immutably differentiate them from their black African slaves, denying them any legal means to challenge their permanent, hereditary bondage. This first developed in the British Caribbean, where by the 1680s, Laws regulating slavery began replacing the previous term for those on top of the hierarchy, Christian, with white. And this legal fiction was very quickly accepted as a social and biological one too. It then spread to British North America. European settlers there began to conceive of themselves as white, which led to even more concrete ideas of Indian inferiority. They were now not just considered to be culturally and religiously inferior as they were before, but also innately racially inferior. Therefore, they were held to be completely undeserving of sovereignty over their land. Thus, white settlers held that taking Indian lands in the West was simply their birthright, because they were members of a supposedly superior race. No more justification needed. This was additionally facilitated by a rapid increase in the white settler population throughout the 18th century, to the point that settlers outnumbered natives by a ratio of at least 4-1. With this strength in numbers relative to before, they suddenly got much braver and began to far more frequently uncompromisingly push their claims for the Indian lands that they believed to be their birthright. Many settlers in Britain's North American colonies thus came to see negotiation, compromise, and coexistence with natives as obsolete. Why bother when they could just take the land with their overwhelming numbers and exclude the inferior Indians from it? So the king's proclamation limiting expansion on Indian lands was seen as completely unacceptable. 14 years later, it became a significant contributing factor to the rebellion of the colonists against the British Crown. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, himself a wealthy speculator in Western Indian lands, who stood to profit handsomely from their conquest, listed among the grievances that the colonists had with the king the fact that he had raised the conditions of new appropriations of lands and endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. A key part of the liberty that the American revolutionaries called for was their liberty to conquer and settle more Indian territory. The incredibly influential Jefferson quickly became the formative figure of what would later come to be known as the ideology of manifest destiny. Even at this early point, he was already envisioning the USA as a continental empire that might one day even control all of the Americas. He wrote in 1786 that our confederacy must be viewed as the nest from which all America, north and south, is to be peopled, and later that it is impossible not to look forward to distant times when our rapid multiplication will expand itself beyond those limits and cover the whole northern, if not the southern continent. Jefferson, as one of the most important founding fathers of the US state, an important figure in the US War of Independence, and as one of the country's first presidents, provided crucially important intellectual legitimacy to the idea that settlers had a right to claim Indian territory. He did this with his imagining of a coast-to-coast American empire with so much land that any white man could claim a substantial plot and make a prosperous living for himself and his family as a farmer. This is what he likely had in mind when he wrote of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. White settlers were promised the liberty and happiness of having their own agrarian estate to work as independent yeoman farmers, or of course to work their slaves on. Jefferson thus imagined the USA as an agrarian state, which he said would be built much on the enlargement of the resources of life, going hand in hand with the enlargement of our territory by those who labor in the earth, whom he believed were the chosen people of God. Ordinary white people were promised and expected their own land, and the way for them to get it was to head west. The obvious issue with this is that this was Indian land. For it to be settled peacefully by white people, as Jefferson, Washington, and most of the other founding fathers had hoped, the Indians who lived there would need to somehow be made to just give it up without the need for force. So their plan, which was quickly implemented by President George Washington after independence, was to offer Indians the possibility of assimilating into the American way of life and culture nature, erasing their own ways of life, cultures, and religions in the process, provided that they willingly gave up their land and in doing so, settled on much smaller tracts of land to the east, away from the frontier. In theory, this fell short of outright physical genocide, but that incredible display of restraint was nonetheless completely self-serving, a means of clearing Indian territory for white settlement without having to resort to costly wars in which whites would inevitably die too. Citizenship was also legally limited to whites, so clearly there was never any real intent to let Indians assimilate as equals regardless. It was simply a ploy to get them out of the way in the easiest way possible. If Native Americans did not agree to this arrangement, in which they would both be stripped of their ancestral lands and disappear as a discernible group, then this would be taken as a justification to attack them and seize their land by force, solving the problem of their defiance through forced displacement, mass murder, or both. US dealings with Indians were thus always backed by the threat of violent conquest. So in reality, this choice actually offered Indians no real choice at all. As historian Pete Cackle wrote, early American Indian policymakers gave Indian peoples two choices: resist American expansion and risk extermination, or assimilate into the white culture. Their existence as distinct Native American peoples was to be erased regardless. Nothing would be allowed to get in the way of the USA's manifest destiny. Peaceful coexistence with Indians who didn't want to give up their land and ways of life was, for Jefferson and the policymakers and millions of other white Americans who he influenced, never an option. As the historian Anthony Wallace summarized, Jefferson strongly favored the separation or elimination of disparate ethnic groups, Indians and blacks, who refused to disappear through civilization or assimilation. This was a considerable radicalization from the previous status quo of colonization, where Indians and white settlers often lived close to each other, trading and coexisting in relative peace, at least compared to the post-independence USA. I'm not saying that nothing bad happened, because tons of bad things happened, but it was just not the same. There had been many outrages, conquests, land thefts, wars, and even genocides, but this was the first time that settlers had demanded exclusive domain over the entire landmass in such a radical way. A huge reason for this shift, which complemented the spread of the idea of a superior white race, was that, as mentioned earlier, the white settler population in British territory had rapidly increased in number and was now much more capable of simply taking Indian land through brute force. So it was the independent USA and its white settler population that first sought to take exclusive domain over the land by systemically cleansing the North American continent of natives who didn't acknowledge white superiority and agree to their own eventual elimination through assimilation. Jefferson's commitment to this idea was serious. In 1812, when most Indians sided with the British Empire over the USA in that year's war, a very predictable eventuality since the US was actively settling and conquering their lands, so Britain was their natural ally of convenience, Jefferson seriously contemplated the complete physical genocide of native tribes who resist American expansion, in retaliation for their defiance of the benevolent offer of complete land cession and assimilation. A final solution to the Indian question. This vision of a vast American empire also necessarily brought the US into conflict with other European powers' claims to Indian land in North America, and even many of these claims ended up being transferred to the US, thanks largely to either the threat of or actual violence. The Louisiana Purchase from France, for example, is commonly imagined to have been a simple deal between two equal parties, but it was actually the result of an implicit threat of war. Congress proposed war plans which involved raising 80,000 troops to invade if France didn't accept, and Jefferson, president at the time, sent the army to the border. France, with its troops tied up elsewhere, chose to sell an even larger area of land than the Americans had asked for at a much cheaper price in order to salvage something from the situation, rather than refusing, trying to hold the territory, and being drawn into a war which they almost certainly would have lost. Implicit threats of, or outright, military action were later also used in the acquisition of Florida and Oregon, while Mexico, whose land American politicians and settlers alike had long coveted, was invaded in an official war with openly expansionist motivations, resulting in the US annexation of half of that country. Jefferson's vision of westward expansion became overwhelmingly accepted in American society, but the Indian policies that he implemented and inspired, which already amounted to cultural genocide at the very least, hit predictable roadblocks when put into practice. As already noted, many Indian nations chose to resist rather than give up their land and simply submit to their erasure. As Robert J. Miller put it, to be fair, Jefferson used the words exterminate and extirpate in connection with tribes that violently resisted American efforts. But could he, or would we today, expect the Indian people and their governments to have done anything less than to fight to preserve their homelands, their cultures, their religions, and their livelihoods? Should they have just passively sat back and done nothing while the United States took their lands? The conflicts caused by this policy led to further radicalization of settlers on the western frontier, who, shocked that the Indians would dare to fight back and deny them their supposed birthright, demanded that they be rapidly and violently removed or exterminated. They rejected even Jefferson's notion that Indians should be allowed to assimilate and occupy farmland in the proximity of white citizens, despite the obvious utility that this held, in the fact that much bigger expanses of land to the west would be cleared up for white settlement as a result. So even the Indians who did everything that white Americans had demanded of them came to be perceived as enemies. The culmination of this is best demonstrated in what was done to the assimilated Cherokee in the South. They allied with Britain in the War of Independence, hoping that the Crown would help to protect their lands from ongoing settler encroachment. After the war was lost, the defeated Cherokee signed a treaty to be made a protectorate of the United States with a much reduced territory, the rest of their lands being freed up for white settlement. For the next couple of decades, they lived peacefully alongside white Americans and assimilated into the settler way of life, just as Jefferson had hoped Indians would. They built farms, European-style homes, schools, and churches, and adopted agricultural methods indistinguishable from those of their white neighbors, even including the ownership of black slaves and the use of white indentured laborers. Some Cherokee even became settlers themselves, encroaching on the land of other Indian nations in the fashion that white Americans were doing, and they adopted the civilization versus savagery rhetoric of white people, believing themselves superior to other Indian groups who had not adopted European ways. But after the discovery of gold in Georgia in the late 1820s, settler militias began encroaching on this Cherokee land, starting a decade-long campaign of violence which involved the destruction and theft of their land, possessions, and resources. Even if they took up settler ways and gave up most of their original land to whites, just as had been demanded of them, the land that they were left with was still coveted and their presence seen as an affront. White settlers were convinced that their superiority gave them a divine right to Indian land, regardless of whether the Indians were assimilated or not, and thus simply couldn't abide to live alongside them any longer. A view which was, once again, institutionalized by the fact that citizenship was limited to whites, which codified this supposed superiority into law and denied all Indians any real legal status. When push came to shove and the US government had to choose between abiding by Jeffersonian assimilation promises and the demands of white settlers, they chose to betray the Cherokee by seizing their lands and forcibly removing them westwards, dumping them in Oklahoma. 4,000 out of 16,000 of them died on the way. This was but one of the countless times that the US government sided with white settlers, even over friendly assimilated Indians, who were clearly in the right according even to the US's own laws and standards. This happened without exception, making it clear, if it wasn't already, that the Jeffersonian offer of assimilation was, at its core, never even remotely a genuine humanitarian pursuit, but rather just a way to clear Indian land for white settlement. Assimilated Indians were never going to be allowed to coexist with white settlers as promised. In truth, it was little more than a temporary measure, undertaken to get them out of the way until they could be more definitively removed. Just an easier, less costly way to seize Indian land and clear the path for the USA to manifest its destiny all the way to the Pacific Ocean. As the historian Kathleen Duval summarized, in the contest between Indians who were good friends to the government and white squatters who disobeyed the government's orders at every turn, the latter won. The Cherokees exposed the central contradiction in the assimilation policy. It was designed at least as much for the purpose of freeing land for white settlement as it was for the preparation of Indians to join the Republic. When those goals came into conflict, the government of and for white men always chose the former. The betrayal and brutal forced deportations of the Cherokee and other Indian nations who had faithfully abided by Jefferson's assimilation terms happened during and after the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and this is no coincidence. Jackson, like Jefferson, believed that owning farmland was key to the pursuit of happiness of the white everyman, and that the role of the federal government was to aggressively pursue the westward expansion required to ensure that they had it, creating a coast-to-coast American state in the process. But unlike Jefferson, Jackson was a frontier settler himself, and also a prominent military general who already had a reputation for brutality from his intimate involvement in decades of Indian conflicts. So he departed from Jefferson in the fact that, like most other frontier settlers, he believed that Indians were so savage and inferior that assimilation would be impossible. Thus, the only solution to the Indian question was for all of them, irrespective of where or how they lived, to be forced to move as far west as possible, out of the way of settlers, and outright exterminated if they dared to resist. Jackson embodied the radicalization that was inevitable when Jefferson's ideas were applied to the practical reality, in which settlers still believed that they had the right to the land of even the most well-assimilated Indians. Jefferson's choice of give us your land and assimilate or be exterminated took only a few decades to evolve into give us your land and get out of our way or be exterminated. This was not at all a surprising development for anyone involved either. Jefferson was, in fact, the one who'd first come up with the idea of mass Indian removals 50 years earlier. He'd even personally flagrantly violated treaties and carried a few removals out himself during his own presidency, albeit on a much smaller scale. So even before the War of Independence, Jefferson knew that his disingenuous and violent assimilate or perish policy would eventually result in a move to a generalized remove or perish policy. Jackson made clear his intent to carry out mass forced removals and physical extermination as default policies in his 1833 annual presidential message. That those Indian tribes cannot exist surrounded by our settlements and in continual contact with our citizens is certain. They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. Established in the midst of another and a superior race, and without appreciating the causes of their inferiority or seeking to control them, they must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances and ere long disappear. Jackson was not alone in this sentiment. By the early 1820s, such beliefs were already widespread, and especially among Western settlers. Despite the fact that nations like the Cherokee had shown assimilation to be possible, the increasingly more radical white supremacist ideology of American society made it unacceptable. Most settlers had come to consider all Indians, friend or foe, assimilated or not, as part of the same inferior race. So when they were outraged that Indians on the frontier dared to defend their land from settlers rather than simply giving it up, they considered even entirely different groups of Indians living further east as agriculturalists among whites to be collectively responsible. And so the idea of Indian assimilation was marginalized, replaced by the belief that it was impossible. The popular opinion now dictated that, as historian Reginald Horseman wrote, it was neither circumstances nor environment, but specific, inherent physical differences that accounted for the failure of the non-Caucasian races to achieve Christianity and civilization. The practical consequences of this Jacksonian evolution of Jeffersonian thought on the Indian question were even more catastrophic for Indians than those of the already genocidal assimilation policy. The aforementioned removals, which mostly occurred during Jackson's presidency, are the most egregious example. These removals were, according to the US government, legitimized by treaties with native groups. But these treaties were, for all intents and purposes, falsified. The US side was well aware that Indians weren't just gonna sign their land away and agree to be deported thousands of miles west. This was unimportant to Jackson. He'd already written way back in 1817, when he was a prominent general who'd already been directly responsible for atrocities against Indians, that he viewed treaties with the Indians as an absurdity. So the supposed treaties that he ended up forming to justify the forced removals known collectively as the Trail of Tears were both backed by threats of violence and clearly duplicitous. Negotiators sought out Indians who were little more than random individuals with no actual power to make such decisions, and bribed them in exchange for them signing pieces of paper on Jackson's terms. These pieces of paper were then used to justify the violent land seizures and forced removal of tens of thousands of people who were very clearly not going willingly. For example, the treaty that legally backed the removal of the Cherokee was signed by a delegation that had no actual power to represent them. 99% of Cherokees rejected it, including their elected principal chief, yet the US government still used it to justify the seizure of all Eastern Cherokee land and their forced deportation to the West. These on-paper legal barriers were little more than formalities. In practice, whenever settlers coveted Indian land, the US government always ended up finding a roundabout way to sign off on its seizure, especially from Jackson onwards. Those who refused to cede their land to whites and instead resisted were frequently offered no mercy, true to the promise of both the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian choice. This was equally true in cases where treaties were in place, which theoretically made white encroachment on Indian land illegal. In 1836, Creek Indians living on land allotted for them via treaty in Alabama resorted to violent force to defend their territory. White people had been building settlements there for years, yet the US and Alabama state governments had done nothing to stop them, leaving the Creek with no other options. Jackson took this as a convenient justification to finally get rid of them. He sent soldiers to carry out indiscriminate massacres of men, the elderly, women, and children, and forcibly removed the survivors to Oklahoma. Some factions of Creeks had actually disagreed with resorting to violence and fought alongside American forces against those among their people who had. As thanks for this, they weren't given any special treatment. They were also forcibly removed. Around 25% of the deported Creeks died during the journey alone. The problem was not whether they were friend or foe, but simply that they were Indians. And Indians, according to white American society and government, had no right to anything but to disappear. Jacksonian modifications to earlier thought on the Indian question continued to dictate policy in the decades following his presidency. The hunger for Indian land, combined with the notion that they were not even fit to take up European ways and live segregated from whites, but rather needed to be removed or exterminated, resulted in a repeating pattern of massacre, conquest, and the forced displacement of the survivors. Indian lands in the West were continuously encroached upon by white settlers. The only option offered to the Indians who lived there by the USA once this happened, aside from death, was forced removal further west. Thousands inevitably died during these journeys, and the complete uprooting of entire native societies to entirely different, often unsuitable lands caused more miseries, such as the destruction of their economies, social bonds, and traditional ways of life, which led to starvation and societal destruction. Exactly what you would expect when you just uproot thousands or tens of thousands of people and dump them somewhere. In both its intent and results, this practice constituted a sort of attempted genocide by attrition, less dramatic and immediate than hands-on mass killing, but with a similar result regardless. This additionally brought them into conflict with other Indians further to the west, whose ancestral lands they were being forced onto. And all of this was temporary regardless, as the goal of Manifest Destiny was to annex everything from coast to coast anyway. The plan was that settlers would, in the future, push the frontier further west and eventually also begin to encroach on the land that these Indians had been deported to, and then the entire cycle would just repeat itself once more. Predictably, most Indians didn't exactly see this as an appealing option, so they inevitably reacted by defending their territory from settler encroachment instead. This would then always be taken as justification by the settlers to attempt to drive the Indians out violently. Usually, this started out with attacks from settler militias best described as death squads, who were intent on wiping out Indian people and their settlements, while they simultaneously called on the federal government for more help, and it always duly obliged, sending troops to continue the work of the settlers and definitively remove or eliminate the surviving Indians, leaving their land open for white settlement. Following decades of this constant cycle of warfare and removal, alongside epidemics of disease, the native population was heavily reduced, their social bonds devastated, and their peoples demoralized, until they became largely unable to effectively resist anymore. In 1845, the writer John Sullivan finally gave this already long-standing colonial ideology the adequate name of Manifest Destiny. He wrote that it was the USA's manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. The belief that white Americans had a special right to simply take all of the Indian land on the continent had scarcely before been so well put. By 1850, white settlements existed across nearly all of the present-day mainland US, and California, with its massive Pacific coast, was admitted to the Union after being annexed from Mexico. This made the US a truly coast-to-coast empire for the first time. To California's east, there lay just a few more US territories. Just as had happened continuously since the US's founding, these would eventually be incorporated into the Unionist states once their remaining Indian populations were eliminated, removed, or reduced, in order to enable more extensive white settlement. Around this same time, justifications for racism couched in the rhetoric of science were gaining in popularity, which very nicely complemented the settlers' already ingrained belief in their innate superiority. From the 1830s onwards, spurred by the desire to further justify African slavery and the continued conquest of Indian lands, many American intellectuals made crucial contributions to these theories. By the 1840s and 50s, they had already been overwhelmingly accepted among white American society. As the historian Reginald Horseman wrote, in the first half of the 19th century, many in the United States were anxious to justify the enslavement of the blacks and the expulsion and possible extermination of the Indians. The American intellectual community did not merely absorb European ideas, it also fed European racial appetites with scientific theories stemming from the supposed knowledge and observation of blacks and Indians. In this era, the popular periodicals, the press, and many American politicians eagerly sought scientific proof for racial distinctions and for the prevailing American and world order. The intellectual community provided the evidence that they needed. By the 1840s, the American theorists on race were providing a mass of material defending innate differences between races. These ideas were sweeping all before them in America, and were being used in Europe by those who were challenging the long-established views on the unity of the human race. By the early 1850s, the inherent inequality of races was simply accepted as a scientific fact in America. As scientific racism continued to develop from there, its hegemony would only strengthen in American society, particularly after Darwinist ideas started to be misappropriated from the 1860s onwards by those eager to even further justify what they'd already long believed. By 1851, it was already becoming apparent that Indians could not be endlessly deported further and further to the west, due to the fact that they'd, eventually reach the sea and run out of a west to deport them to. So Congress passed the Indian Appropriations Act, which formally created a system of Indian reservations that the survivors could be forced onto and confined to. While the prevailing view remained that Indian inferiority made assimilation into a European lifestyle near impossible, a directed campaign of systemic physical murder of the entire Indian population was still considered to be too extreme and too expensive of a measure, as well as just completely unnecessary, as the US had already taken most of their territory anyway. The view was that they were basically on the verge of dying out themselves, so why put in that effort? So the chosen alternative was to concentrate them onto these reservations, segregate them from the white population, try to force them to take up European ways, and leave them to their fate, which white Americans believed was to die off completely and disappear from the world. Essentially, they were forced onto these reservations with the expectation that they would all die within a generation or two, out of sight and out of mind. The land allocated to each native group was infinitely smaller than their original territory, thought not to be of much value, and often located far from their ancestral lands. Most of them were not agriculturalists, and the land they were confined to was too small for them to survive through traditional hunting. Thus, they quickly became reliant on whatever meager US government rations were provided. Relocation onto these strictly government-controlled reservations was compulsory, and their residents were not allowed to leave without permission. As usual, any Indians who resisted this would face overwhelming violent force. These reservations were little more than grossly underfunded open-air prisons. They were designed primarily to concentrate Indians into as small of an area as possible in order to get them out of the way of further white settlement. A more permanent solution to the Indian question than the cycle of westward removals had been. The establishment of these reservations was overwhelmingly violent. As historian Robert Utley summarized, Indians could not be induced to stay on reservations until they had been whipped, either by the army or by invading settlers. In California and the Pacific Northwest, Indians had accepted reservations only after heavy-handed violence. In Texas, New Mexico, and the Great Plains, efforts to corral tribes on reservations faltered or failed altogether due to both intermittent and prolonged warfare. Where reservations were established, their true purpose was immediately evident. Already in 1853, just 2 years after the passing of the Indian Appropriations Act, Tom Fitzpatrick, an Indian agent who had visited many of them, wrote that the reservation system was little more than the legalized murder of a whole nation. For at least around 40 years afterwards, Native Americans on around 60 different reservations were kept in states of starvation or near starvation. Considering the pervasive level of government control over them and their populations, this was a period of neglect that lasted far too long for it to possibly be considered as anything less than a conscious, genocidal choice. The dishonesty behind the feigned concern for Indian welfare that had been used to justify all three evolutions in Indian policy, from assimilation to removal and now to concentration, was more evident than ever before. Now that natives were thought to be definitively out of the way, it completely evaporated. A small minority of white voices did speak up for the perilous condition of reservation Indians, but their pleas invariably met deaf ears. And those who did complain were not exactly real advocates either. They still invariably agreed that Indians were simply inferior and should be forced to give up their land, move on to reservations, and adopt American culture. Even the supposed defenders of the Indians still hoped that Indianness would eventually be wiped out. And indeed, in cases where Indians resisted being forced into this misery, genocidal tactics were employed by the US government, such as mass killings of non-combatants, the destructions of settlements, and the intentional destruction of their food supplies. The mass state-sanctioned killing of buffalo in the 1870s, for example, was intended to destroy the traditional food supply of Indians in the Great Plains, leaving them the choice between starvation or finally accepting the reservation system, where the federal government could control their movement and keep them dependent on rations. The US government itself plainly admitted to the goals and effects of anti-Indian violence. A joint special congressional committee acknowledged in 1867 that their side was responsible for the massive decline in the Indian population. They blamed the steady and resistless emigration of white men into the West for causing it, and acknowledged that American whites were responsible for the vast majority of violent conflicts with Indians, which they explicitly called wars of extermination. More and more Indians were gradually forcibly concentrated throughout the rest of the 19th century. Some held out longer than others, but by 1890, American settlers had successfully expanded across the entire continent, and almost all Indians were confined to reservations. Yet even the reservation system was considered something of an affront to the divine right of whites to the land. So in the 1880s, the federal government started to pass laws that broke them up, splitting them between individual Indian owners as regular old private property, abolishing the tribal territories that had been established through the reservation system in the process. The aim was to make it possible for white settlers to pressure, coerce, and threaten them into selling off what little land they had left. And they achieved this goal very effectively. By 1934, Indians had lost 2/3 of the land initially allotted for them. This was combined with the abduction of Indian children from reservations to government-funded boarding schools, where they would be taught in the American way, punished for practicing their own culture or language, and thus forcibly assimilated. Such schools had always existed, but now that Indians had been nearly entirely concentrated under US government control, it was simpler for such a policy to be carried out far more aggressively than ever before. Depriving Indian children of their culture was seen as a way to solve the Indian question once and for all, as without generational transmission, it was believed that it would quickly disappear. Together with the aforementioned privatization of Indian lands, the idea was that both Indianness itself and any distinction between Indian and non-Indian land would no longer exist. These initiatives were a full-blown attack on the continued existence of distinct Native American peoples. The idea of a much-reduced Indian population living independently and continuing their own way of life, even on heavily reduced areas of land under the strict control of the government, was still seen as intolerable by white society. It was not until 1934, when the government of Franklin D. Roosevelt granted Indians much greater sovereignty over their by then much smaller reservations, that the policy of direct government control and forced assimilation was finally ended, and Indians were finally at least left to continue their traditional ways if they so choose, though not completely by any respect, I must clarify. Also incredibly crucial to this story is the Homestead Act of 1862, through which the government began giving settlers, both native-born and immigrants, allotments of free land that had been conquered from Indians in the West. This was the most literal manifestation of white settler entitlement to Indian land yet. Jefferson's vision of the USA manifesting its destiny across endless Indian land, which the prior inhabitants would be cleared from so that white farmers could have the liberty to pursue their happiness, had well and truly been fulfilled, and Native Americans had paid the ultimate price in return. They'd lost nearly all of their territory and suffered catastrophic destruction of their bodies, communities, culture, and ways of life due to conscious actions undertaken by American settlers and the US state, who had exactly those goals in mind. From 1800 to 1900, the Indian population of the US had declined by 60%, from around 600,000 to 250,000. This massive decrease, which implies at least around 400,000 to 500,000 excess deaths in total, caused by a combination of the theft of Indian land, the anti-Indian policies of the US state, and disease, the spread of which was also interlinked with those other factors, as it was greatly facilitated by said policies. Periodic genocidal warfare, constant removals and concentrations, and the intentional destruction of Indian villages and food supplies all combined together to disastrous effects. In terms of direct killing, even the US government itself estimated that 53,500 Indians had been directly violently killed by Americans from the late 1700s to 1860, a number that is almost certainly an underestimation since it comes directly from the culprit itself, and hundreds of thousands more were killed indirectly via causes that were still an obvious consequence of actions taken by the US, such as forced removals resulting in deaths from exposure and exhaustion during the journey and starvation afterwards, and the concentration of nomadic communities onto small reservations in abhorrent conditions, causing malnutrition, ill health, starvation, and epidemics of disease. This catastrophic decline of Native American communities and the wanton theft of their land was the result of deliberately genocidal ideas, policies, and practices that were core to the USA's very foundations, which were themselves a radicalization of the earlier ideas and practices of British colonialism. These ideas were consciously constructed and implemented with the explicit and openly stated goal, duly realized, of clearing a believed inferior race from living space destined for superior white settlers. Germany arrived very late to the European colonization game. It only established its first real significant colonies after 1884 in Africa. This meant that German colonial ideologues, planners, and administrators started out with centuries of precedents to draw on, and the American one, which was contemporaneously reaching its culmination, became the main inspiration in their only colony with a significant settler population, Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia. The German intellectual community had enthusiastically consumed translated material from the US on the Indian question throughout the 19th century, starting with essays justifying Jacksonian removal policies in the 1830s and continuing until the very end of the century. As a result, by the 1870s and 1880s, they were already very familiar with American practices, justifications, and ideology, and the US was commonly seen as the exemplary model for a potential future German settler colony. One of the most important of these figures was Friedrich Ratzel, the best-known geographer in Germany at the time, and a staunch advocate for German colonial expansionism. He'd visited the United States in 1874 and was so impressed by the success of their colonial project that upon returning, he worked extensively to plan and justify German colonialism. He published a number of influential works on the subject, which used American colonialism as the primary reference point. As the German historian Jens Uwe Guttel summarized, according to Ratzel, the white settlement of North America was the best example for why and how Germans should engage in policies of colonial expansion. The United States demonstrated that the availability of land for settlement stabilized domestic politics. Ratzel looked at the ideology and practice of manifest destiny and approvingly linked the success of the US state to the speed and extent of its expansion onto Indian land. It was thanks to this, he posited, that the US had managed to conquer vast amounts of space that, just as Thomas Jefferson had hoped, could be enjoyed by its white population. Ratzel believed that it was this abundance of space that had made the USA so successful when compared to the supposedly crowded lands of Western Europe. In his 1893 book, Political Geography of the United States of America, he summarized this in his own words. In the United States, the greatness of space has counteracted decay. The will and the power to colonize that enliven so many individuals have time and time again enlarged the national economic sphere. The draining and dissipating effects of the vast space have contributed to the wonderful stability of the American Constitution, which for 100 years has endured fewer changes than any European constitution. This was a notion that was very appreciated also in the US itself. Ratzel's publications resulted in a transatlantic dialogue with some of the most prominent intellectuals of American colonialism. They were even influential at Harvard University. One of these intellectuals was Frederick Jackson Turner, a highly influential American historian whose wildly popular frontier thesis enthusiastically venerated the USA's insatiable expansionism. Ratzel was particularly inspired by this thesis, and he and other German colonialists would frequently draw on Turner's idea that it was the USA's colonial frontier and its constant expansion west into indigenous land that had been the most overwhelmingly important driver of the nation's progress, far eclipsing anything else. Ratzel extensively referenced Turner, believing that his description of US colonialism could be replicated in Africa by Germany. Turner himself returned the favor, saying that he saw Ratzel's work as so important that it should be required reading for American intellectuals. Ratzel drew on the US example so often that even Americans arguing for further subjugation of Indians and expansion to new frontiers outside of the mainland US found it very useful. Turner, too, eventually noticed the pervasive influence of the US precedent on German colonial policy, writing that American colonization has become the mother of German colonial policy. Ratzel's writing, along with that of other German intellectuals inspired by the American example, was influential in shaping German colonization. By 1905, when the German Empire was in the middle of a genocide of the native Herero and Nama peoples in German Southwest Africa, its officials, ideologues, and settlers justified their actions by pointing to their go-to example, claiming again and again that they were merely replicating the successful colonial policy of the USA for the good of Germany. Even the German general in charge of this mass murder campaign, Lothar von Troffer, wrote in his diary the simple phrase, "The natives must give way. Look at America." Another illustrative example comes from Bernhard Dernberg, head of Germany's colonial department. He'd visited the US on a fact-finding mission to learn from it directly, and said approvingly in 1907 that there can be no doubt that some native tribes have to vanish, just as some animals perish because of the impact of civilization if they are not to degenerate and become encumbrances on the state. The history of the colonization of the United States, clearly the biggest colonial endeavor the world has ever known, had as its first act the complete annihilation of its native peoples. That was said in the middle of the Herero and Nama genocide in order to justify it. These are just a few examples of the importance of the US precedent to German colonialists, which Guttel accurately summarizes. Ratzel and Dernberg believe the United States in general, and American westward expansion in particular, were exemplary for German colonization efforts. These perceptions, though not uncontested, were so widely shared in the early years of the 20th century that during and after Lothar von Troffer's murderous campaign against the Herero and Nama in German Southwest Africa, colonial administrators and proponents of colonialism in both German Southwest Africa and the German mainland viewed American westward expansion and Indian policies as worthy of emulation in Germany's only settler the colony. Now we return to Ratzel. As is already apparent with the quotes featured in the intro, there were doubtlessly links between the German colonial obsession with the USA and Nazism. But Ratzel's work is particularly important because it's a direct confirmation of a shared genealogy between the ideology and practices that came to be known as manifest destiny and very important facets of Nazism, especially when considered in the context of his direct engagement with American scholars. In 1897, Ratzel formulated an influential theory considered scientific at the time. He combined his earlier ideas regarding the importance of space to the success of the USA with Darwinism, arguing that competition for this space was an overwhelmingly important driver of natural selection. For him, in order to succeed, living organisms such as plants, animals, and people needed to constantly expand their living space, and all biological organisms were thus engaged in a constant drive to colonize the living space of other organisms. He wrote, "Clearly, the limitation of living space on Earth demands that an old species vacate the space that a new one needs to develop. In this sense, new creation and progress presuppose retreat and demise." He then applied this idea to nations themselves. For him, they too were a sort of biological entity constrained by these same laws, so they also had to expand their living space via conquest and colonization in order to survive and flourish. The most successful nations would therefore be those that, like successful organisms, at least according to Ratzel, were able to colonize the most territory and rid it of competitors. Logically then, the colonial expansion of superior peoples and their removal or extermination of those inferior to them was legitimized by the fact that such action was, scientifically, both inevitable and required for a nation to be successful, and thus something that any government with the interests of its people in mind would, naturally, actively pursue. For Ratzel, this explained and justified the colonization of the USA that he had long studied in cold scientific terms, fitting in very nicely with the long-held beliefs of American settlers, as first articulated by figures like Jefferson and Jackson, that were upheld by the American intellectuals that Ratzel drew from, admired, and engaged with. He even defined the specific character of this colonization in very Jeffersonian terms, as the taking over of agricultural land for direct, small unit farming by the new occupiers. This also, crucially, justified the German colonial endeavors that he had long advocated for. He called this concept Lebensraum, living space in English. While Ratzel often wrote in neutral-sounding, biological terms and didn't really make prescriptions as to what ought to be done by Germany within his scientific work, he was an outspoken advocate of German colonialism and expansionism using the US as a model. That his theories seem perfectly designed to legitimize the political beliefs that he'd held for decades beforehand was not remotely a coincidence, and that others quickly picked them up and developed them to justify similar German expansionism was no coincidence either. By the time of the First World War, Lebensraum, in the sense that Ratzel had used it, had diffused widely, and was already an important ideological justification used by German imperialists, both liberal and conservative. Regular school students were even exposed to it via the education system directly through Ratzel's own work. After Germany lost the war, the concept became an even more important part of political programs. Ratzel was a liberal in a very racist, genocidal, late 19th century sort of way, much like the vast majority of his contemporary German colonial ideologues. And while he differed with those further to the right in this respect, including the soon-to-surface Nazis, who didn't like liberals very much, the Lebensraum theory was, nonetheless, seen as something of a neutral scientific analysis, so it was accepted all across the political spectrum, despite any ideological differences. By the 1920s, Lebensraum was a staple of German colonialist ideologies, and crucially, radical conservatives began to use it to justify proposals for German expansionism in Eastern Europe, rather than just colonization outside of Europe. It was from there that it would soon reach the Nazis. Some were also integrating scientific racism into the already social Darwinist Lebensraum theory, which they found quite easy to do. They argued that not only should Germany expand for its own good, but also that the Slavs and Jews in the East were biologically inferior and unable to use their living space to its full potential. Therefore, it was only natural that the supposedly superior Germanic people move in and take it from them. Ratzel, in his work on Lebensraum, had written many passages that neatly fit in with this edition. For example, this one. And note that with the term Germanic here, he includes Anglo-Americans, because in his idea, the USA had been colonized by Germanic people, which of course further justified Germans doing colonialism. Germanic and French settlers in North America began by stripping the indigenous population of their lands and subsisted on it through hunting and agriculture. The result was a battle of annihilation, where the prize at stake was space. The soil. It was the Indians who lost this battle, having but a weak grip on the soil. The idea of German expansion into Eastern Europe was nothing new, and dated back centuries. What was new was that 1. It was becoming much more popular, and 2. With the concept of Lebensraum, a specific ideological genealogy had been formed with the history of European settler colonialism. Eastern expansion was being conceived of in the context of European colonialism elsewhere in the world. Its advocates were looking towards the East, just as American settlers had looked towards the West, looking upon its indigenous populations just as they had, and justifying this with discourses inspired by them that had been spread by German colonialists since the late 19th century. This is the context in which one Adolf Hitler picked up on the concept of Lebensraum. Immediately following World War I, Karl Haushofer, a geographer educated by Ratzel, had taken up and built upon Ratzel's theory of Lebensraum, helping to spread the narrative that Germany was unjustly limited by its living space. One of his students was Rudolf Hess, an early member of the Nazi Party who was imprisoned with Adolf Hitler after the beer hall putsch in 1923. Haushofer visited them in jail on numerous occasions, and through him and Hess, Hitler was briefed on the Ratzelian conception of Lebensraum. This clearly influenced him, as he very quickly started to integrate it into his political program. Less than 2 years later, in 1925, Hitler's infamous ideological manifesto was released, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Within, the word Lebensraum was used 11 times. The concept's influence is very clearly pervasive throughout large parts of the text, and it thereafter became a staple of Nazi ideology. Hitler found Ratzel's idea that expanding living space was simply a natural prerequisite for the success of a nation to be reason enough to advocate for a future German conquest of Eastern Europe. And he wrote in those terms exactly. Soil exists for the people which possesses the force to take it and the industry to cultivate it. Nature knows no political boundaries. First, she puts living creatures on the globe and watches the free play of forces. She then confers the master's right on her favorite child, the strongest in courage and industry. When a people limits itself territorially, it will be forced to have recourse to self-limitation at a time when the other peoples are still continuing to increase. Someday this situation will arise, and the smaller the living space at the disposal of the people, the sooner it will happen. And note that if these quotes from Hitler don't make much sense to you, it's not your fault, it's because he was a terrible writer. You really need to read them over once or twice to really get what he was trying to say. He additionally specifically argued that this living space should not be made up of overseas settler colonies, but rather that it should be contiguous, like the mainland USA. Thus, in his prescriptions for the future of Germany, he concluded, "A war with France will only achieve meaning if it offers rear cover for an enlargement of our people's living space in Europe, for it is not in overseas colonial acquisitions that we must see the solution to this problem, but exclusively in the acquisition of territory for settlement, which will enhance the area of the mother country itself, and hence not only keep the new settlers in the most intimate community with the land of their origin, but secure for the total area those advantages which lie in having such a unified magnitude of territory." And to this end, he proposed an Eastern policy in the sense of acquiring the necessary soil for our German people. Like with the American ideal of the settler farmer, Hitler emphasized that it was best that this living space be used for small and medium-scale family farms. Preserving a healthy peasant class as a foundation for a whole nation can never be valued highly enough. Many of our present-day sufferings are only the consequence of the unhealthy relationship between rural and city population. A solid stock of small and middle peasants has at all times been the best defense against social ills, such as those we possess today. This mirrored Ratzel, who was quoted earlier using the USA as an example of a country which he perceived as having a relative lack of social issues due to its abundance of space. Hitler later echoed Ratzel even more precisely on this specific point, saying that the USA's immense inner strength was derived from its massive base territory in comparison with the absurdly small home territory of European states. On top of that, he pointed to the lack of miscegenation among its white population and its racialized citizenship laws as the best extant example of what he wanted to do in Germany. Hitler's plan of settler colonization was to be the driving force of his program. In fact, he wrote that this was the principal aim of Nazi foreign policy, meaning that all of his warmongering was, in the end, directed towards that goal. In Hitler's unpublished second book, written 3 years later in 1928, he further expanded on the importance of the conquest of Lebensraum, even stating that his other plans were all ultimately just a part of his settler colonial ambitions, including the infamous and much more commonly known Nazi race policy. Foreign policy is the art of safeguarding and securing the necessary living space in quantity and quality for a people. Domestic policy is the art of preserving the necessary employment of force for this in the form of its race value and numbers. And he also added that the success of the US was not solely due to its vast living space, but also due to its racist immigration and anti-miscegenation policies. Hence his emphasis on such policies being a prerequisite to the success of his plan to colonize Eastern Europe. That the American Union was able to achieve such a threatening height is not based on the fact that millions of people formed a state there, but on the fact that many square kilometers of the most fertile and the richest soil is inhabited by millions of people of the highest race value. He also again echoed Ratzel exactly by using the USA as an example of a country with sufficient living space for its people. For example, he wrote, "The relation of the population to the soil surface of the American continent is infinitely more favorable than the analogous conditions of European nations to their living spaces. Regardless of how Italy, or let's say Germany, carry out the internal colonization of their soil through scientific and methodical activity, there always remains the disproportion of the number of their population to the soil, as measured against the relation of the population of the American Union to the soil of the Union. And if a further increase of the population were possible for Italy or Germany through the utmost industry, then this would be possible in the American Union up to a multiple of theirs. And the German people's prospects are hopeless. Neither the present living space, nor that achieved by a restoration of the borders of 1914, will allow us to lead a life analogous to that of the American people." The USA's existence as a large country that was successfully built on an abundance of living space not only provided an example of what Germany needed to do, but it also provided Hitler with another justification for actually doing it. Ratzel's theory dictated that the people with the most abundant and properly used living space would emerge victorious, and Hitler took this idea to its logical conclusion within the frame of his imperial ambitions. Germany would need to expand its Lebensraum to the same level as the US if it was ever going to be able to challenge and supplant it on the world stage. The link to Ratzel's conception of Lebensraum is clear both in the direct chain between Ratzel, Haushofer, Hess, and Hitler, and its huge influence on Hitler's writings and speeches from 1925 onwards. Nazi Lebensraum was thus a radicalization of an ideology that ultimately began in the United States. First popularly articulated by Jefferson, modified by Jackson, upheld by multiple generations of American governments, intellectuals, and US society, and then picked up on by German colonialists who adopted American theory and practice as their own, a process which involved a reciprocal transatlantic dialogue between American and German colonial intellectuals. The Nazis then picked things up from there, modifying and expanding upon the ideas of those that came before them, with Ratzel being the most significant individual link in this chain. His theories directly inspired the plans for Eastern European settler colonialism that became one of the most important pillars of Nazi ideology. This is very important to remember and will be elaborated on further later in this section. The nature of Nazism as a fundamentally settler colonial project is key to understanding it and its links to its precedents beyond a superficial level. While Lebensraum's relation to Manifest Destiny was the most significant and direct way in which the US influenced the Nazis, it was also not by any means their only exposure to the US precedent. Hitler, along with many other Germans, had long been enamored with the romanticism of the US colonial frontier, the Wild West, and the Americans versus Indians dichotomy. A big part of this public knowledge was due to the books of Karl May. May was an incredibly popular German author of American frontier fiction during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Funnily enough though, May had never actually been to the USA, so he constructed his vision of it for his books from the propagandistic translated American literature that reached Germany, similar to how German colonialist intellectuals had been influenced by the translated works of American ideologues. He got practically all of the finer details, such as recountings of specific local customs, completely wrong, but his overall presentation was in line with the pro-colonialism norm. He did at least present a few Native American characters in a sympathetic, idealized way, but the majority of them were nonetheless presented negatively, as violent people whose often brutal demise and dispossession at the hands of white settlers was well deserved. Karl May had a very significant influence on German perceptions of the US. Hitler himself is known to have been a fanatical fan. Many Germans took May's relatively innocent children's books as a primary source for their understanding of the USA. But Hitler went one step further. He saw these books as sort of conceptual and strategic manuals for how to actually do colonialism. Note that I'm being totally serious here, though it does sound like a joke. Hitler really did look to his favorite children's books when crafting his genocidal plans, much like how a more modern adult child might reference Harry Potter. It would obviously be a bit of a stretch to claim that Karl May's depictions of the USA had some incredibly formative role in inspiring Nazi colonialism, on a similar level to Lebensraum. But May's work was nonetheless significant in that it provided readers with a vision of a successful colonial project, one with boundless open spaces just waiting to be settled that coincidentally fit perfectly with Lebensraum. It also exposed them to the concept of frontier native settler relations for the first time, including warfare between the groups. Many therefore used May as a reference point when imagining the Nazi East, Hitler included. At one point, he even ordered that Karl May's books about fighting Indians, his words, be distributed among Nazi troops in the East because, according to him, the Russians fight like Indians. After 1933, once the Nazis had actually taken power, denouncements coming from the US combined with Hitler's idea of an inevitable confrontation with the USA and made it no longer prudent for Nazi theory and propaganda to make many more favorable direct references to the USA in public. It went from being singled out as the best extant example of what Hitler wanted to achieve with Eastern Europe, to being denounced as a degenerative liberal state controlled by a vast Jewish conspiracy. Nevertheless, its influence on Nazi colonialism had already been solidified, so they continued to draw upon it. It was, of course, most importantly, core to Ratzel's concept of Lebensraum, and thus was inherent to its very foundations. But still, less overt public references to American colonialism continued to be made. For example, the famous American phrase encouraging colonialism, "Go west, young man," emblematic of manifest destiny, was replicated in Nazi newspapers as "Go east, young man." Propaganda posters depicted German settlers in covered wagons heading east, referencing the iconic American settler wagon convoys. And children's books were written that aimed to acquaint them with Lebensraum by transferring the cowboys and Indians' romanticism of the American West to Eastern Europe. In Der Untermensch, an SS pamphlet written by Heinrich Himmler, the Nazis' chief colonial ideologue besides Hitler himself, the East was described as a black earth that could be a paradise, the California of Europe. And Konrad Meyer, the Nazi who authored their principal indigenous policy, General Plan Ost, wrote that the America of the Germanic peoples lies in Eastern Europe. Direct private evocations of the US also still continued. In 1941, Hitler said that our colonizing penetration must be constantly progressive until it reaches the stage where our own colonists far outnumber the native inhabitants. In the context of the Lebensraum ideology and the US precedent, this is clearly referring to a US-like, continuously progressing colonial frontier, especially in the light of him then saying that our Mississippi River must be the Volga. He also emphasized the importance of colonization to his plans with the US example. The full quote cited in the intro was, "There's only one duty, to Germanize this country by the immigration of Germans, and to look upon the natives as Indians." The full context of another one of the quotes that was cited in the intro is also very revealing. When discussing violence wrought against native populations in order to capture their land and resources, Hitler appealed to the idea that this immediate brutality would very quickly be forgotten. Those who eat German bread today do not think about the fact that it comes from the granaries that we conquered in the 12th century. A similar process will repeat itself in the East for a second time as in the conquest of America. He also directly said that the Nazi East would be the new land of boundless possibilities, supplanting America in that respect. This is especially relevant in light of the way that the East was presented in Nazi propaganda, as a great land of opportunity, where one could pursue happiness, a German version of the earlier American precedent. The Nazis conceptualized Eastern Europe in the same way Americans had the west of the North American continent. Americans had their Wild West, while the Nazis had their Wild East, waiting to be tamed just as America had been. Before the war began, the Nazis were very willing to use the implied or outright threat of military force to annex territory, just as the US had with Louisiana, Florida, and Oregon. Austria and large parts of Czechoslovakia were annexed in this way in 1938. Then, once they had actually started the war, Nazi plans and practices were frequently clearly inspired by, or directly lifted from, those that had been carried out in the US, and their language and rhetoric was often indistinguishable from that of 19th century American settlers. Hitler himself often sounded exactly like a typical Jacksonian ideologue. Regarding indigenous people of the East, he said that anyone who talks about cherishing the local inhabitant and civilizing him goes straight off to a concentration camp. The Nazis created detailed, long-term plans for settler colonization of the East, which were partly implemented during the war. As the Nazi military pushed the front line further and further eastwards, the indigenous people, principally Jews and Slavs, were to have their land and property appropriated for German settlement. Millions of Slav children who were deemed to be racially pure enough would be kidnapped from their families and forcibly Germanized to assist in the rapid increase of the German population that the Nazis envisioned. Some able-bodied indigenous people were to be enslaved in order to help establish the new German colonies, and eventually, once feasible, all adult Slavs and some Jews would be forcibly removed to reservations further to the east, especially in Siberia, while the majority of Jews were to be forced onto reservations specifically for them. One of these was actually established during the war in Lublin, Poland, and another was planned on the African island of Madagascar. These would be strictly controlled and operated by the Nazis to ensure that their victims could never reform their society and potentially pose a threat. They hoped that they would slowly die out due to disease and starvation, fostered by the high concentration of many people into a small area, the lack of adequate medical care, and the completely insufficient rations that they provided. The Nazis candidly acknowledged that their appropriation of farms and food supplies, combined with the massive upheavals of entire populations, would result in the mass starvation of tens of millions. Anyone who resisted these plans in any way was to be subject to immediate summary execution, and their communities collectively punished with massacre. If all of this sounds very similar to the American practices that I described earlier, that's because it was. The Nazis' initial colonial plans and practices, which lasted from 1939 until late 1941, practically all have clear analogues in the colonization of the USA. The granting of conquered land to German settlers, primarily for farming, is analogous to the granting of conquered Indian land to aspiring American farmers, especially after the passing of the Homestead Act. The obsession with and idealization of specifically small and medium-scale farms, through which settlers could pursue happiness, was also a core part of this for both projects. These settlers even traveled eastwards in covered, horse-drawn wagons, just as Americans had in the most famous and evocative images of American colonialism. The Nazis' forced removal of indigenous people to strictly controlled reservations, with many dying along the way, was clearly inspired by both Jacksonian removal policies and the American reservation system, which had been well known and admired in Germany since at least the late 19th century. That this resulted in obvious consequences like the spread of disease, malnutrition, and starvation was also shared in both projects. Additionally, both the Nazis and the Americans intentionally deprived natives of food supplies to cause mass starvation. The enslavement of indigenous people in Eastern Europe is similar to that of the enslavement of both Black Africans and Native Americans in the USA. It's not very well known, but Indian survivors of battles and raids were often taken as slaves by white settlers in the USA. At least 50,000 were enslaved in total between 1800 and 1900. The kidnapping and Germanization of Slav children is similar to that of the kidnapping and Americanization of Indian children. Just as the Nazis constantly used the obviously inevitable native resistance to colonization as a convenient justification to indiscriminately mass murder any native in sight, the Americans had too. And additionally, the Nazis treated long-assimilated German Jews as no different to non-German Jews in the East, much like how, for much of the 19th century, Americans still refused to accept even assimilated Indians. It's important to elaborate further here, as the Holocaust and the Nazis' other genocides are not very commonly understood in this way. From 1939 to 1942, the Nazis both planned and carried out their genocides in ways that mirrored colonial precedents. In this period, they were not yet carrying out the industrial mass murder that most of us are much more familiar with. Rather, indigenous people were either forcibly removed, or, when this was not yet possible, concentrated into supposedly temporary holding camps to await eventual deportation or die of disease or starvation. This was combined with frequent mass shootings carried out by military units and settler militias, just as with the US precedent. As Peter Cackle wrote, The legacy of the Nazi racial imperial project is the shooting massacre at Babi Yar, colonial-style mass shootings, as much as Auschwitz, modern industrial killings. Up until 1942, Nazi violence and killing in the East used nothing more modern than a rifle. In the towns and villages of the Nazi East, it was, indeed, a Holocaust by bullets. The genocides of the Nazis, and particularly the Holocaust, are typically understood as something of a historical anomaly, almost totally disconnected from any precedent. Rarely are they ever conceptualized correctly as part of a settler colonial project. The industrial nature of the Holocaust after 1942 indeed had no historical precedents, but it was still part of a radical evolution of colonial policy. Following the beginning of Soviet counteroffensives on the Eastern Front in late 1941, it became clear that the original Nazi plans for forced removals were no longer feasible, as they were not going to be in control of the land they'd hoped to establish reservations on and deport indigenous people to. With these more, quote, indirect, unquote, means of dealing with the native problem clearly off the table, they shifted to an industrial system of genocide to attempt to physically wipe them out as quickly as possible. They overwhelmingly prioritized the industrial murder of Jews over that of Slavs because they saw Slavs as little more than zombie-like puppets of a global Jewish conspiracy and thus as lower priority targets. It is important now to explain that Nazi conspiracies about Jewish people were intrinsically linked to their goal of obtaining Lebensraum in the East. Firstly, the Nazis believed that such a colonial project would not be possible, while their imagined secret Jewish cabal still existed, dictating global affairs from behind the scenes. They believed this cabal had a special hatred for Germany and Germans, and thus would do everything possible to prevent German expansion. Secondly, as was clear from the Hitler quote that I cited earlier, they also believed that the success of such an endeavor depended on maintaining the strength of the German people, which they said required racial purity. Their ideology dictated this to be incompatible with the existence of supposedly inferior German Jews. These two facets of Nazi logic meant that they believed that the genocide of Jews would be a precondition for the success of their Lebensraum project, and they greatly preferred not to carry out this genocide within Germany itself, as that would have been too difficult to hide from both civilian German and international eyes. This is why every Nazi death camp was established in the occupied East. Thus, the Nazi conquest of the East was itself an important motivating factor of, and a prerequisite to, the Holocaust, both in its original form, deportations, forced removals, reservations, and mass shootings, and in its final form, mass industrial genocide. All of this was irrevocably linked to the theory of Lebensraum and cannot be divorced from it. The majority of Nazi actions and atrocities were carried out because they believed that doing so was a precondition for the success of their settlement project. For another example, their main reason for invading Western Europe was because they expected Western retaliation against further Eastern invasions. It is therefore not an exaggeration to say that Nazism's settler colonial aspect is what most defined it. While their anti-Semitism didn't stem from their settler colonialism, it nonetheless became intimately linked to it. Eastern expansion was at the core of Nazi motivations for their anti-Semitic actions, including the Holocaust. The Nazis were obsessed with Lebensraum's notion of space, and also found its implied racial component to fit perfectly with their obsession with race. They inherited the former and aspects of the latter from their German predecessors, and through them, also from the predecessor ideology of Manifest Destiny, which was just as much an ideology of space as Nazi Lebensraum was, and nearly as much one of race. It's not surprising, then, that they ended up looking towards the US as an example, and repeated and built on so many American practices. While I've acknowledged the ideological and referential links and the many practical similarities between these two settler colonial projects, it's still important to note their differences and look at why such differences manifested. That they were similar and part of an ideological and historical chain does not mean that they were exactly the same. American colonialism was undeniably incredibly brutal. Its final goal of a massive nation spanning the North American continent with no discernible remaining native peoples mirrored the final goal of the Nazis in Eastern Europe, and its lust for land was just as strong as that of Nazi Germany. That said, the Nazis were clearly more radical, and everything that they took from their precedents was applied in even more extreme ways. In some cases, this was a result of further ideological radicalization, and in others, it was due to different practical circumstances. The most obvious difference is the Nazis' conspirational and genocidal anti-Semitism, as we just discussed. There is no direct analog for this in US settler colonialism, as it didn't meaningfully involve conspirational ideas of all-controlling internal enemy populations within American society, nor a global conspiracy by a specific group. This aspect of Nazism came from historical European anti-Semitism, particularly German, and was not, at least initially, directly linked to settler colonialism in any meaningful way. The Nazis took two separate historical currents, the convenient scapegoat of a purported Jewish conspiracy both in Germany and around the world, and European-style settler colonialism and its associated racism, and combined them. This was a unique development of Nazi ideology without precedent. They enacted policies against all Jews, both in and outside of Germany itself, that were even more extreme than their policies against other indigenous people in the East. While Slavs were, as Hitler had dictated, looked upon as Indians, Jews were seen and treated as an even lower class of colonized. However, for the purposes of this video, we're primarily concerned with the influence of Manifest Destiny and American practices, specifically on the settler colonial aspect of Nazi ideology. That Nazism had other aspects to it that it didn't share with the United States is expected, and this doesn't reduce the significance of their links. The differences in the on-the-ground circumstances were also immense. The Nazis attempted to apply American-style ideologies and practices to a scenario that was, in practice, very different to the American one. As Kakel summarized, Hitler and Himmler were blind to the very different realities that they faced on the ground in the East in relation to the on-the-ground realities early Americans faced in the West. The Nazis were invading an area that was infinitely more densely populated. The native population of what would become the contiguous USA was around 700,000 at the time of the US Declaration of Independence, split between dozens upon dozens of often disunited groups that each generally numbered from the thousands to the tens of thousands, inhabiting 7.5 million square kilometers of territory, a population density of around 1 person per 10 square kilometers. By contrast, east of Germany from Poland to the eastern extremities of Russia, around 300 million people inhabited 19 million square kilometers, a density of about 150 people per 10 square kilometers. That is to say, 150 times denser than in the USA. And that's even including the relatively lightly populated but incredibly massive land area of Siberia and land to the east of Ukraine, which was never meaningfully settled due to the Nazis being pushed back by the Red Army. If we were to instead look solely at Poland, which was the place where Nazi settler colonialism reached by far its most advanced practical stage, it had a population of around 35 million people spread across a land area of 389,000 square kilometers, which represents a population density of 890 people per 10 square kilometers. That is 890 times that of the indigenous population of the US at the moment of independence. Eastern European peoples were also far more politically unified than American Indians, being divided into nation-states made up of hundreds of thousands to hundreds of millions of people. These factors allowed them to resist and push back against their would-be colonizers far more effectively, eventually defeating them at great cost. The Indians of the United States faced the polar opposite situation. They were greatly outnumbered both in terms of civilian population and military manpower. The American conquest of the West is commonly imagined as having been accomplished by small groups of white settlers against massive hordes of Indians. But the reality is that Indian warriors were heavily outnumbered by white soldiers and militia in nearly every conflict. The Nazis also had a well-organized war machine with huge manpower and a large, long-established population, compared to the newer population of the US and its more ragtag armed forces. The Nazi frontier was pushed forward as a concerted effort of the military, who made way for their settlers, while the American frontier was at first pushed forward by a complementary mix of outright military conquest combined with gradual settler encroachment, with the military conquest often being justified by Indian retaliation against said encroachments. Government was still the driving force, always decisive either through direct intervention or material support, but in the American case, private actors with government support played a role that was far less prominent for the Nazis. These differences were partly circumstantial, partly ideological. American colonialism was definitely more individualistic than that of the Nazis, but the American situation of drastically lower indigenous population density with much more fragmented polities also enabled this style of settlement. It was quite easy for a small number of American settlers to finish erecting and fortifying a dwelling before being discovered by local Indians, but one could not imagine small groups of Nazi settlers trying to encroach on Polish land in the same way, given its massively higher population density and the fact that it had a defined border protected and patrolled by security forces. If the Nazis had the practical option of replicating this aspect of American colonialism, there's no reason to believe that they wouldn't have attempted to do so. The Nazi East also didn't last nearly as long as the American West, only existing for about 6 years in total. It's conceivable that, if the Nazis had succeeded in their invasion plans, their colonization and policies towards native peoples would have gone through different phases over time, as the USA's did in its much longer history. Additionally, up until 1942, the Nazis' native policy mirrored that of the post-Jackson USA. Massacres combined with removal and concentration. They departed from this when faced with the formidable opposition of the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front, which quickly made it clear that their original plans would not be realized. They then abandoned any idea of removal and adopted the official policy of outright mass murder whenever possible, aiming to completely wipe out the Jewish people first and the Slavic and other indigenous peoples afterwards. This intensified what already easily qualified as multiple genocides into atrocities without historical precedent. By the end of the war, the Nazis had murdered 6 million Jews and around 11 million Slavs. This was the result of the Nazis applying the Jacksonian logic of get out of the way or die to Eastern Europe. So if the American settler colonial project had also faced a similar existential threat, like a far more populous and more united native polity that was capable of decisively defeating them militarily, there is no reason whatsoever to believe that Americans wouldn't also have attempted to carry out outright complete physical extermination of indigenous peoples. Both settler colonial projects looked at native peoples in much the same way, as inferior beings who were barriers to the settlement of their superior race, and who thus needed to be dealt with in a definitive way. Both saw their capture of entire contiguous land masses as a necessity and a birthright, etc. As Cackle put it, There is no reason to believe that the early American settler state and its white citizens would have hesitated to take whatever steps were necessary to ensure the success of their nation-state and its empire-building project. In the Nazi East, genocidal patterns, logics, and pathologies derived from the USA settlement model became operational and were carried to their logical, albeit much more radical, extremes. The US was, all at once, the primary practical model for the Nazi colonization of Eastern Europe, a crucial ideological forebear, and the most important extant example used to show and justify what they wanted to achieve. Jeffersonianism led to Jacksonianism, which was then picked up by German colonialists in Africa, such as Friedrich Ratzel, who then had a defining influence on Nazi colonial ideology, plans, and practice. Thus, aside from its invention of industrial-style genocide, Nazism's murder of around 20 million people was not the complete historical anomaly that it's often presented as, nor was the Jewish Holocaust solely the result of the Nazis' fanatical anti-Semitism. These events were, rather, a part of a modern historical continuum, intrinsically linked to previous European settler colonialism in Ireland, the Americas, Africa, and Asia, and the USA in particular. Ideologies and practices were developed over time in an interlinked process that took place over centuries, before eventually returning to Europe in the form of Nazism. Nazism was, therefore, modern European settler colonialism coming home, and being applied to mainland Europe itself in its culminative, most radicalized form. So, what can we take from this conclusion? What kind of questions does it raise? First, a deeper understanding and proper contextualization of Nazism is very important. The common view of it as some sort of historical anomaly disconnected from its precedents, or at most as being solely connected with historical anti-Semitism and post-World War I German grievances and not much else, is reductive and incomplete. When its ideology, plans, and practices are examined, it's undeniable that it was, at its core, a fundamentally settler colonial project, intimately connected to the broader history of settler colonialism in the last 400 to 500 years, and the US precedent in particular. Any examination of Nazism that doesn't acknowledge the overarching importance of its obsession with Eastern European Lebensraum is wholly incomplete. This understanding of Nazism also provides us with an important point of reflection for how we conceive of settler colonialism in general, in the past, present, and perhaps even further into the future. Nazism is universally denounced by all remotely decent human beings, yet other settler colonial projects that followed, or that still do follow, very similar logic and modalities rarely invite anywhere near that same level of wide-scale derision, and are often defended even by those who have little issue denouncing Nazism. American founding fathers like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and dozens upon dozens of others who came after them, saw Indians as little more than inconvenient obstacles to white conquest and settlement, who were to be exterminated without prejudice if they dared to resist their own dispossession. They would not settle for anything less than white American dominion over all Indian land. These logics and end goals were barely different to those of Hitler, Himmler, and other architects of Nazi settler colonialism and genocide, and especially not when we consider the even more uncompromising Jacksonian radicalization that they directly inherited. Eastern Europeans were their Indians, and the Wild East was their Wild West. This goes for far more than just the US case too. Similar ideologies and practices also drove the early history of countries like Canada, Australia, and Argentina, and were crucially important to their historical trajectories for decades or even centuries afterwards. Yet rarely are they ever conceived of as even remotely analogous to Nazism's Eastern expansion. This is clearly uncomfortable to consider for those of us who are from these countries, especially given how sanitized and mythologized the common understandings of their histories are. But the fact is that they absolutely were analogous, and the only factors really differentiating the end result were coincidences of success, scale, and circumstance. This obviously raises questions about the states that many of us currently live in which the settler-colonial social relation, first established hundreds of years ago, still very much exists. Many of the same indigenous nations whose land these countries stole still exist today, left with whatever parcels of territory that settler society has deigned to allow them to keep, or in some cases with nothing at all. The reality of this past manifests clearly in the present, as the best that most indigenous groups today can realistically obtain is little more than limited, largely tokenistic forms of recognition from the very states that were founded on their dispossession and genocide. As is clearly evident today, the American strategy of concentration on reservations has achieved with flying colors its goal of removing Native Americans as a barrier to the ambitions of the settler state and settler society. Indigenous resistance nonetheless continues and is sometimes effective, at least at achieving relatively small victories, but it's difficult to imagine the actual decolonization of such thoroughly colonized societies, where colonization was core to the very founding of the state itself. That something is difficult to imagine, however, does not disqualify it as a goal worth pursuing. All of the most important social and political achievements in history were, after all, also difficult to imagine just decades or even years before they ended up actually happening. It's clear as day that colonization is an ongoing process. As things stand now, the ultimate power over indigenous peoples, regardless of how much autonomy they've sometimes won on paper, is still held by the settler states which were founded on their land and based around their exclusion. The settler-colonial social relation will continue to exist until settler societies themselves become far more open to honest engagement with indigenous peoples and help to work towards its abolition for the good of all. The first step towards this is for people and institutions within these societies to actually acknowledge the oft-denied and ignored fact that this relation even exists and the truth of the history behind its formation. The question of whether a hypothetical Eastern European Nazi empire could ever have eventually supplanted its genocidal founding is not merely an abstract thought experiment. It applies equally to a number of presently existing settler colonial states with similar foundings, and especially to the United States of America, its most important predecessor. It is an inquiry that merits very deep consideration, inviting serious reflection not just on the nationalist mythology that justifies, glorifies, and sanitizes the reality of the past, but also on what is to be done about the structures that still exist today as a result. Thank you very much for watching. Hey, so if you were wondering where I'd been for the last 2 months or so, this video was it. This was the most arduous and complicated video that I've made so far, in research, writing, production, basically everything. And the only reason that I'm able to take that much time to make a video, which in all likelihood isn't gonna get that many views and probably is gonna get demonetized because come on, it's about the Nazis, is thanks to those who support me monetarily on Patreon and Ko-fi. So if you like this video so much that you'd like to give me some money so that you could support me so that I can make some more, you can head on over there. Or you can just subscribe to my channel, or you can not do any of that stuff, whatever you want. Now I'd just like to thank all of my supporters, and especially my $25 plus supporters: Jesse Hosick, Jel Cribson, Shub, Potte, A Big Mean Cat, Mischief and Fins, Benny G, Brosnan, Darcius B., Evan Carroll, Nyam Mitchell, William Tomlinson, Brandon Flowers, Arthur Simak Jones, and my $10 plus patrons: Revis, Daller, Christopher Strom, Khan KLS, Nico Del Sesto, Michael Strauss, Abdullah Ki, Zanguzeng, Melissa Gomez, Industrial Robot, Insurgente, Naomi Starlight, Dominic Cusinelli, Crouton Baguette, Violet Rain, Christian Corniels, Commissar Fart Sean, Average is Awesome, Cab the Bird Ranger, Memushin, Sean Paul Casina, JG, Nick Hall, Roja, Uminia Kresneti, S for Pierre-Louis, Justin Bailey 77, and Cincione Brezgal. Thank you all. See you again when I finish the next video, whenever that may be.